left Sinai, Israel eventually comes to the border of the Promised Land and sends in spies to check it out. A representative of each of the tribes is sent to check out the land. Two of the spies come back and report how great the land is, and the other 10 report about how big the people are. So the Israelites complain that Yahweh has brought them out of Egypt to be wiped out by these giant Canaanites. And Yahweh is angry with the lack of faith that Israel is showing after he has done so much for them. After he has delivered them out of Egypt with these great miracles, now they believe that he can't overcome the Canaanites on their behalf. And so he sends them to go wander in the wilderness until that entire generation dies out. And then he will bring their children into the land. So for 40 years they wander the wilderness of Sinai out in the desert, during which Moses eventually does die, and leadership is passed to Joshua. And then Joshua takes this next generation and leads them across the Jordan River into the land, and they begin to conquer it with the help of Yahweh. But sometimes they would ignore Yahweh's instructions and they would lose some battles. And sometimes they would make alliances with nations whom Yahweh told them not to make alliances with. And so once they actually settled into the Promised Land, they were not the sole occupants, but were surrounded by other nations. Nations that were being driven out of the land because of their wickedness. And so a power struggle comes within this land. Israel would begin to ignore Yahweh and start worshiping other gods. And so Yahweh would allow one of these other nations to come and take over Israel and oppress them. And eventually they would remember Yahweh and cry out to him for help. And Yahweh would raise a deliverer, a judge, who would deliver them from oppression of whatever nation is oppressing them. And then the judge would pass away, and Israel eventually will forget about Yahweh again and start worshiping other gods. And so again, they'd be conquered and oppressed. They'd remember Yahweh, cry out to him. Yahweh would raise a judge and deliver them again. And this cycle goes on over and over and over again, as it says in the book of Judges. And the book of Judges Israel says constantly, Israel has no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, eventually Israel decides that they want to have a king, like all the other nations. But Yahweh didn't want them to be like the other nations. He wanted them to be different so that they could show the other nations how to be in proper relationship with Yahweh, in proper relationship with each other, and proper relationship with creation. But Yahweh concedes and agrees to give them a king, but he warns them that the king will be like the other human kings and will take their food and make them work for him. At this time, Israel is led by a judge called Samuel, a prophet of Yahweh. And Yahweh tells Samuel to go to a certain city. And while he's there, a man will come to him that Yahweh will point out that will be Israel's first king. So Samuel travels to the city, and the city plans a festival to Yahweh because Yahweh's prophet is there. Meanwhile, there is a man in the tribe of Benjamin named Kish, whose donkeys have gone missing. And so he sends his son Saul and a servant to go and find them. And Saul is looking everywhere for these donkeys, but cannot find them. So eventually he says to the servant that's with him, let's head back home so that my dad doesn't add us to the list of things that are missing. But the servant says, I heard that there is a man of God in the city near here. Let's go to him and see if he can tell us where the donkeys are. So they head to the city and look for the man of God. And as they come into the city, they come across Samuel right away. And Yahweh says to Samuel, this is the man who's going to be king. As they come up to Samuel, Saul says, we're looking for the man of God. Do you know where he is? And Samuel replies, I am the prophet that you're looking for. Don't worry about your dad's donkeys. They've been found a few days ago. But instead come to this festival as my special guest. So Saul attends the festival and they party into the night. The next morning, Samuel took Saul and anointed him king. But it wasn't official until all Israel came together. So Samuel calls all of Israel together, and they're going to cast lots to see who the first king is. Lots were like a game of chance. They would put names on rocks or sticks. They put them in the bucket and they'd cast them. And whichever one landed on the ground first was the one that was picked. And since it was a game of chance, they believed that Yahweh was then in control of the results. And this is how they determined what Yahweh was choosing. And so they took the 12 tribes of Israel and wrote each tribe's name on a rock, put it in the bucket and cast it, and the tribe of Benjamin was selected. And they took all the family names in the tribe of Benjamin, put them on rocks, and cast them out of the bucket. And the family of Kish landed. So they took all the males in the family of Kish, wrote their names on rocks and casted them, and the name Saul was picked. As his name was announced, the people looked around, but he was nowhere to be seen. They searched and searched, and finally they found him hiding behind some barrels. And when they brought him out, the people noticed that he was head and shoulders taller than everyone else, so they thought they were going to be a great king. In Saul, Yahweh gave the people the king that they wanted, but he knew that the king that they wanted wasn't the right king for them. They wanted a king that looked like the other kings, big and strong, but a proper king would have a heart after Yahweh's own, a man who loved Yahweh and loved people. The people look at the outward appearances, but God looks at the heart. And Saul's heart was paranoid. He was a paranoid king. One of Yahweh's laws was that the priests and the prophets were set apart to perform the rituals and offer the sacrifices. They are the ones who were purified in order to offer these to God. Well, one day the Israelites were off to fight the Philistines, and they were waiting for Samuel to get there to offer the sacrifice to Yahweh, and to ask Yahweh to give them favor and give them victory. But Samuel was getting old, and it was taking a long time for him to get there, and the soldiers began getting restless. And so Saul became worried, wondering what his soldiers were thinking about him, worried that they were going to desert him. So he decided that he would offer the sacrifice himself, and he does so. And right when he finishes, Samuel comes, and he sees the smoke and the ashes from the sacrifice. "What have you done?" he asks Saul. "Well, you were taking a while, and the men were getting restless, so I offered the sacrifice myself." "You've done a foolish thing. Do you think you can rush Yahweh? You should have trusted in Yahweh and his timing, but instead you took things into your own hands. Yahweh has rejected you as king, and will find another." Well, Saul grew afraid and begged Samuel to change his mind, but it was Yahweh who decided, not Samuel. So Samuel gets sent to anoint a better king, and he gets sent out to this farm in Bethlehem. It's owned by a man named Jesse. And he asked Jesse to bring out all of his sons for him, for one of them will be the next king of Israel. So Jesse brings out 7 of his sons. And Samuel stands in front of the oldest, named Eliab, and thinks, surely this must be the next king. He's tall, and he's strong, and he's handsome. But Yahweh says this isn't him. For humans look at outward appearances, but I look at the heart. So the second oldest, Abinadab, comes forward, and Yahweh says no. The third oldest steps forward, Shemaiah, and Yahweh says no. And they keep going down the line until the 7th son eventually steps forward, and Yahweh says no. And Samuel is confused. He looks at Jesse and says, Yahweh hasn't chosen any of your sons. Are you sure you don't have any other sons? And Jesse thinks, and he says, oh yeah, I do. I have the youngest one. He's out in the field tending the sheep. He completely forgot about his youngest son, or to even think it was even worth bringing out his youngest son to be considered to be king by the prophet. Hashtag youngest son problems. So they bring out the youngest from the field, and this is David. And Yahweh says, this is the one, anoint him king. Now Saul is still functionally king, and David won't actually take over the throne until Saul dies. But right away we see a difference between Saul and David. The Israelites are at war with a nation called Philistine, and the two armies line up from across from each other when a giant of a man comes out of the Philistine ranks. He's over 9 feet tall, and his bronze coat of mail weighs 125 pounds. And Goliath is his name. When he steps out and he yells at the Israelite army, why are you all coming out to fight? I am the Philistine champion, but you are only servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves, but if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." Well, the Israelites and Saul are terrified, and so no one will step out. And Goliath would do this day after day, and no one would step out to face him. And David's brothers were in the Israelite army, while David had stayed back and looked after the flock. So David's dad asked him to take some food out to his brothers. And so David sets out, and he gets to the battlefield. He drops the things off with the person in charge of supplies and heads to the front lines because they're just about getting ready to battle to watch. And he finds his brothers and he greets them. And when he's talking with his brothers, Goliath steps out and does his daily routine. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves, but if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." And the Israelite army retreats. And as they do, David overhears a soldier say, "Did you hear that the king has offered a reward for whoever kills the giant? He will give the man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." Well, David becomes curious and begins to ask around whether this is true. And word reaches Saul that David was asking about Goliath, and so Saul summons David to come see him. And David goes to Saul and says, "Don't worry about this Philistine. I will go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's trained to be a warrior since his youth." David replied, "I've been looking after my father's sheep and goats. And whenever a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb, I go after it with a club and I beat it to death. This I will do to this Philistine who defies Yahweh our God. Yahweh has saved me from lions and the bears, and he will save me from this Philistine." So Saul gives him permission to go and gives him his armor and his sword, but Saul is much larger than David is, and so the armor doesn't fit, and he can barely move this sword. So David takes off all the armor, goes down the river, picks up 5 smooth stones, and approaches Goliath, armed only with a staff and a sling. And as David approaches, Goliath sneers at him. "Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? Come here and I will kill you and feed your body to the birds and the wild animals." But David replies, "You come at me with sword, javelin, and spear, but I come in the name of Yahweh, God of Israel, and today I will kill you and cut off your head, and everyone will know that Yahweh lives and is the God of Israel." As Goliath moves forward to attack, David ran towards him, reached into his pouch, grabbing a stone, and with his sling hurls it at Goliath. It strikes Goliath in the head, sinking into his skull, and Goliath falls down on his back. David runs over, grabs Goliath's sword, and cuts off his head. The Israelite army celebrates and charges, chasing the retreating Philistine army, and Israel wins the battle because of David's bravery. David becomes Saul's right-hand man and marries Saul's daughter, and everything Saul asks him to do, David does with great success. But Saul soon becomes jealous of David, as people sing songs like, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." So Saul tries to kill David, but David flees into the wilderness. And blinded by jealousy, Saul takes his entire army and chases David through the wilderness, neglecting his duties as king of Israel to chase a man that he is jealous of, until the Philistines start attacking and he has to go back and leave David alone to fend off the Philistines. And eventually, Saul falls in battle against the Philistines, and David becomes king. And he becomes known as a man after God's own heart, and was the best king Israel would have until much, much later on. And God gives David a promise that one of his descendants will sit on the throne forever. This is the beginning of the monarchy of Israel. Now, the problem with Israel's request for a king to Samuel way back earlier in our story is not the fact that they asked for a king. The problem is they wanted a king like the other nations. They were not to be like the other nations. They were to be different, to draw others into a relationship with Yahweh by the way that they lived. They wanted to be like the other nations. So Yahweh warned them that they indeed would have a king like the other nations, instead of the type of king that he wanted for them. And the warning given to them from Samuel was this: "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." He is warning them that the king will do all these things because that's what the other kings of the other nations will do. They take and take and take. But despite this warning, the people say this is what they want. And the thing about this is that they're missing out on their calling by this request. They have decided to take some of the promises that were given to Abraham, but not all of them. Abraham was promised to be made into a great nation. They're now a nation. Abraham was promised to be given the land of Canaan, and they are now dwelling in that land. Abraham was promised to be blessed, and through him bless the world. But now Israel has chosen that they want to be blessed, but they don't want to bless others. Asking for a king like the rest of the nations was to be selfish like the other nations, because the selfishness of those kings of the other nations led the nation itself to be selfish, and that's what happens to Israel. They have become insulated with an us versus them mentality, which is not what God called them to be. God wanted to bless them so that they can bless the other nations. But when they decide to be like the other nations, they abandon that calling to be a blessing to themselves, or to be a blessing to those nations, to draw them into relationship with Yahweh. Instead, they try to keep Yahweh to themselves. But that's not part of the deal. They don't get to be blessed just for the sake of being blessed. They are to be blessed to bless others. And this is all reflected in how they view what they view as a good king for them. Saul knows that he's going to be chosen as king by Lot, for Samuel has already anointed him. So when the lot is going on, what is Saul doing? He's hiding behind some barrels. The people look for him and they find him hiding. But they don't notice the fact that he's scared and cowering and hiding from becoming king. They notice that he's head and shoulders taller than everyone else. And because of that fact, they decide he's going to be a good king. He was viewed as he was viewed as probably being a good king because of his size, so he must be a good fighter. They were looking for somebody who could fight off the Philistines instead of someone who could lead them well. And this is emphasized in the anointing of David. So Saul has to be brought out by the people because he's hiding from being king. David has to be brought out to Samuel to be anointed king because his father doesn't even think it's worth bringing him out. He's the youngest and the smallest. But God looks at the heart and not at outward appearances. Saul was a prime candidate and king in outward appearance, but was cowardly and paranoid and clung to power for the sake of power. David was not a good king from outward appearances, but he was called a man after God's own heart and brings Israel in Israel's golden age. Leadership is a matter of heart and character. Who you are is more important for what kind of leader you will be than what you are able to do. And that is the downfall of so many leaders that we see nowadays. They are celebrated for how many people they can attract, how well they can speak, how much money they can bring in. But the damage they cause because of their lack of character makes none of these other benefits really worth it. They grasp for power rather than looking to help the people they lead. They are selfish, and that is where the problem lies. We are blessed in order to bless others. Look to develop a character that seeks the welfare of others, other than what the world determines a success.